City of Boston. I want to welcome you to Goulston Storrs on behalf of the Living with Water Steering Committee. As many of you know, the Living with Water competition started about last fall when the groups involved in the competition, the Boston Development Authority, the City of Boston, the Boston Harbor Association, and the Boston Society of Architects chose 3 sites in Boston to be subject to the proposals of designers around the world on how we can protect those sites and develop those sites, and taking into account the sea level rise we expect to occur over the next 100 years. Back in January, we received about 50 proposals across all 3 sites. We announced 9 finalists in February, 3 finalists for each site, many of which you're seeing some pictures of as we're talking. And the final judging will take place in June. June 8th. This will be an event at the Boston Society of Architects to announce the final judging. We encourage you and invite you all to come to that. As part of the Living with Water project, we've been holding a series of meetings, get-togethers, charrettes, spin-up sessions to discuss the designs, discuss the principles that the city needs to adopt to prepare for climate change. And with all these designs and great ideas that we're getting, we thought we better hold an event to discuss how do we finance building them. And I'm very pleased that Goulston Storrs is hosting us. And with that, I'll turn you over to our host, Matt Kiefer from Goulston Storrs.
Thank you, Carl. Can you hear me in the back? Is that good? Yeah. One sec here. There we go. Thank you. So delighted to have such a great audience here today for this conversation. As Carl said, this competition has been phenomenal, really. The amount of kind of energy and excitement and ideas that the competition has generated. One of the things that's a little bit unusual about it is that it has a focus not just on innovation, but on implementability. That's not a word to say 3 times quickly, but I think I said it right that time. Implementability is a value that is not often rewarded in design competitions, but is part of this. And as you know from the description, the Boston Redevelopment Authority is one of the 3 sponsors and very interested in what they might learn from this. I'm going to introduce our panel in a minute, but before I do, I just want to say that, you know, in a sense, this is a problem we've all invented. And we're now figuring out how to invent the solutions. They don't really exist yet, and this is a little bit of a conversation about inventing solutions to figure out really how to pay for preparedness rather than react to events after they've occurred. It's the basic premise of our panel today, is to explore ways to prepare in advance of catastrophic events rather than reacting to them after they've occurred. And we have a great panel of people from across disciplines who've been involved in these issues to help guide us through this. And we're also going to take some time for audience questions. I see many people I know in the audience. Many of you have thought about this and practiced in areas related to this for a long time, and certainly have something to contribute to the discussion. So we'll have some time to engage you and to have you engage the speakers as well. And as far as the format, I am going to introduce our panelists and ask them a series of questions. They do not have prepared remarks to make. The slides are actually slides they've contributed of projects that they've been involved in that are just going to scroll behind them as they speak. And you all may refer to them from time to time, feel free to, but It's not a formal slide presentation. So, starting to my right, Laura Cantor is the Executive Vice President and Director of Finance Programs, the Finance Programs Division at MassDevelopment, a state agency, the Commonwealth's Development and Finance Authority. This division sort of spans, they serve governmental entities, private businesses, and nonprofits with a range of financing tools. Laura, in fact, has spent her career in finance, public policy, and economic development. Before going to MassDevelopment in 1996, she worked for State Street Bank and Trust. She was a banker involved in representing bondholders. And she has a background in undergraduate degree in communications from Emerson College and an MBA in finance from Bentley College. Next, in alphabetical order, Wendi Goldsmith. Wendi was the founder and CEO of the Bioengineering Group until recently when she sold the company, a consulting firm dedicated to applying sustainability principles to the design of the built environment. Wendi also has a kind of cross-disciplinary background. She's a professional geologist, also has a degree in landscape design, and she has been involved in climate change adaptation projects around the world, including specifically in New Orleans following Katrina. And we'll hear a little bit about that from Wendi as we go on, including, and also in some waterfront developments in and around Boston. She has multiple degrees in multiple disciplines. I won't list them all, from Yale, UMass, and the Conway School. Next, Nick Iselin is the general manager for urban regeneration for the development business of Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease is an international property and infrastructure development company. Nick is responsible here in the Boston office for the Boston market, the Boston area, as well as pursuing and identifying regeneration projects around New England, particularly in urban locations. Nick has over 15 years of experience both in the public sector and the private sector for UMass Building Authority, the Mass Convention Center Authority, Intercontinental Real Estate, and Twining Properties. He has a master's in architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Arts from Harvard College. And Nick is particularly involved in Clippership Wharf currently. You'll see some Clippership scrolling, a 500-unit approximately housing project on the East Boston waterfront. And in the interest of full disclosure, Nick is a client of Goulston Storrs, but that won't spare him from some difficult questions. And then last, Jamie Springer is a partner at HR+A Advisors. In fact, Jamie established and spearheads their resiliency planning practice. He served for a while as Deputy Director for Community Initiatives for Rebuilding and Resiliency in New York, in the New York Mayor's Office, and was particularly involved both in that capacity working for the city and as a consultant in preparation following Superstorm Sandy, basically preparation for the next storm in New York, which you'll hear about as well. In addition to guiding public sector clients like the City of New York, Jamie guides private sector clients on real estate development strategies and economic and fiscal impact analyses. Jamie's traveled up from New York to be with us here today. Thank you for that, Jamie. He has a bachelor's degree from McGill and a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So, with that, let's start. Maybe the first thing is kind of a general question for each of you, in no particular order. What's stopping us from preparing now? Why isn't it for the most part? And you can break this into, there's sort of a public side to this and a private side to this, to climate change preparedness. Private building owners who could be doing more probably to adapt their buildings, and certainly public infrastructure. Much of which, again, is rebuilt after a storm, but not really built so much in preparation for it, and not really responding in advance of anticipated sea level rise. Why is that? Who wants to start? Tell us, why is it that this isn't, we have plenty of evidence that, right, there are risks in front of us. Why aren't people reacting more? Jamie, do you want to start there?
Sure. I guess the, can you hear me okay?
You hear in the back?
Can you hear me okay?
Not really. Did you turn the mic on?
No,
There's a
was I
little
supposed
button
to?
there. You
All right.
tapped it, yeah.
That would explain it. I guess the primary reason is the reason that you struck this panel, which is that a lot of efforts at physical resiliency are unfinanceable in the present condition, which is a real challenge. So I think, we have a situation in this region and in most of the regions across our country where we have a lot of assets that are built, a lot of assets that are in the course of being financed and constructed. Because there hasn't been a storm that's revealed a lot of the risk that can occur, and because we also have a lot of subsidies for building within the 100-year floodplain, primarily through the National Flood Insurance Program, it's just not, there isn't a financial incentive for someone to act. I guess I'm not going to spend all night talking about New York, but I'm sort of the representative from New York, and so I should say that in the case of New York, it was the same situation, and then Sandy struck and caused $19 billion of damage to the city and its assets, as well as through business disruption, and also revealed that there was such a significant risk in the future as sea levels rise. But also, Congress appropriated $50 billion. Much of that will go to recovery, but a lot of people are spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to use that public funding to finance otherwise unfinanceable resiliency efforts. Right. But I think just the last one, yeah. There are a lot of efforts that are financeable, but the sort of market failures get in the way. And I think, things like establishing a reasonable, regulated level of design flood elevation that's outside of the floodplain to protect buildings that get built in the future that are at risk, or things like finding an opportunity to finance off very valuable real estate that will save a lot of money if it avoids damage through mitigation. Those things can all be done without significant public funding. So I think it's a matter of really figuring out what requires subsidy and what can finance resiliency on a project basis on its own.
Thanks. We'll come back a little bit to some of those ideas about how we might unlock this or outside it's not. Wendi, what's stopping us now?
Yeah, I think that first of all of Jamie's comments about the finance possibilities and hurdles are really true, and I would concur. But I would say there's some other more broad sweeping things I can generalize. We have historically had an approach to a design methodology and a risk management methodology that looks at past data to inform us and guide what our future risks are. And with something as straightforward as build out of the watershed and having less place for water to be stored or infiltrated, so you have more runoff, more stuff trying to fit in these urban stormwater pipes and so on. The more you build, the more you have at risk, and the more different that stormwater behavior is. And we're just kind of catching up on that, and now we have changing precipitation patterns, sea level rise, land subsidence. You put all these together, and the future, in fact, looks very different from the past. But our methods for thinking about it and accounting for it when we make decisions haven't quite caught up. And that's going to be true from a planning and design standpoint, as well as from a financial analysis standpoint, which I think is going to be an underpinning for making these things financeable. And then there's other things having to do with psychology. People don't like to think about a disaster. What does a design professional, whose professional liability is at stake, let alone their reputation, what can they do if they highlight what all the risks are, and maybe there is or isn't enough funding for design to thoroughly mitigate against those risks? Does that not pose a tremendous glaring hole for liability for the ones who step up to notice the problem and steer people toward thinking about them? So I see a lot, I could go on about some hurdles, but there are many, and a lot of them come down to routines and ways.
Inertia and maybe a little avoidance behavior too.
Yeah, some baked-in disincentives within the system.
Nick?
So what's stopping us? We'd like to think that it's not much, and we're trying to practice that way in a project we're implementing here in Boston. The reality is, though, there are a lot of things that weigh in: the underlying economy of a project, the difficulties of building on a decaying water's edge, the difficulty of parking underground and contaminated sites. And so what we're trying to do is reorient the discussion a little bit, and rather than focus on the challenges, focus on the opportunities embedded in all of the things we need to do to make an economically viable project, and that is raising the habitable levels up higher, perhaps higher than we need to, with an added benefit of getting parking out of the ground, and then capitalizing on the opportunities of the additional height relative to our surrounding roadway network and experience of the water. So I think that every real estate project has levers. They're a very complicated set of levers right now, because we're engaged in a discussion about what the new normal standards should be on the waterfront. Where should we place our ground floor? How do we treat FPA spaces, for instance? How do we treat height, building height, in an environment where we are not only being asked to pull our ground floor up, but we're taking a long view at Lend-Lease of how far it's prudent to push our ground floor up. So I think we're living this every day. It's a very interesting discussion. It's evolving every day. And I think we're fortunate to have a site with tremendous attributes where we can unlock, through pulling these levers, the economy of the site. But it is, frankly, it's very thin. I don't want to say razor thin, but it's a very thin line that we're walking relative to the economy of the site, the economy of a place like East Boston versus a North End or South Boston or Back Bay. And so we're trying to make the right decisions. Sustainability is in Lend-Lease's DNA. Resiliency is a big part of our project, and so it's a balancing act, and we're engaged in that discussion now.
Good. Well, Laura, you want to take a stab at this, and we're going to come back and pick up some of the themes we've heard from each of you.
Sure. So Nick was speaking to the challenges of new construction for a private building. And clearly, code and zoning that supports sort of a 100-year vision of where sea levels will be would support a new construction project and achieving a degree of resiliency. For existing buildings, I think new financing tools that make it more attractive and less expensive to finance resiliency improvements, as well as rising insurance rates, would create some built-in incentives. I think until you have those two things and a real clear and present danger that's going to make people make investments in private buildings to avoid a problem, it's harder to get people to do that. And infrastructure, as we know, the state of our public infrastructure, there's so many ways to finance it. New infrastructure can be built to expect issues, but existing infrastructure faces the same competing demands for investment and other crumbling infrastructure elsewhere. So it's just really an overall issue for public financing of our hardscape, which is, as we know, extremely important to the viability of the state.
Right. So we've heard about certainly financial constraints that might need to be overcome for this to happen. A number of you mentioned that, whether it's the availability of specific financing sources or development feasibility being compromised. So we certainly have financial constraints. The main topic today, although we'll talk about some others too. You mentioned regulatory constraints. Might play into this a little bit. We're still regulating for the pre-climate change world in many ways. A lot of height constraints on the waterfront in particular that maybe aren't so helpful. We have some, maybe I'll expand that to incorporate Wendy's planning and regulatory constraints, some planning precepts that are maybe a little outmoded and regulatory constraints. And I'm not sure what to do with the kind of cycle. We have to, it's hard